Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. So happy to have you with us for the program today. A lot of fun. We're going to make kind of a fun announcement a little bit later on. I'm really excited about all of that. We will tell you about that here in just a bit. Connor Riley back with us. It feels like it's been a long time since Connor and I have talked on air, so we'll do that here today. Kind of an interesting look at maybe one of the big challenges for Georgia on the field for the upcoming season. Obviously, everybody's got some unanswered questions, and we'll talk about an unanswered question as it relates to Georgia here today on the program. But to begin with, Georgia got itself a couple of recruiting wins yesterday. We'll talk about both on the show, but one is perhaps more important for a symbolic reason. It's Kirby Smart perhaps making an enemy out of a fellow coach, and you know what typically happens when Kirby Smart does that. So we'll have some fun with that to kick things off here today. Glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro, cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
The Georgia Bulldogs got themselves a recruiting win yesterday. That's not typically, all that surprising of an outcome. Georgia gets a lot of recruiting wins, whether it be for the class of 2025 and the class of 2026. And in fact, Georgia got one from both classes yesterday. We'll talk about both those over the course of our time here together today. We also, by the way, in a few minutes have kind of a fun announcement I want to make for you here today. I believe for the first time we've teased this, but we'll make a fun announcement here coming up in just a little bit. But back to the subject of recruiting. Sometimes recruiting wins have a little extra emphasis on a show like ours because sometimes it's about more than just adding another talented player to a future roster. There's also a little bit of a symbolic value to some of this, and perhaps an example of that yesterday as Georgia brings in 2026 defensive back named Dominic Kelly. Kelly, high school-wise, and we'll show you this on the screen here from the story at DawgNation.com. Kelly, high school-wise, comes from IMG Academy down in Bradenton, Florida. Obviously, gotten used to seeing Georgia win recruiting battles when it comes to players from down there. But the other thing that is interesting here is, for this 2026 four-star defensive back, is Kelly, prior to announcing a pledge to Georgia yesterday, had been committed to the USC Trojans way out in Los Angeles. That's what I said before. You're always happy to get a four-star defensive back. Georgia's had a nice pipeline with IMG Academy. You really like that. But in the case of Kelly, there is also some extra symbolic value here because the fact this is for Georgia another recruiting win over USC. Now, this is true for me for two reasons. I want to walk through both of these here just for a moment. First of all, this is real and this is legitimate. If you want to go back to 2 G-Days ago, this would have been G-Day 2023. When we found out that Bear Alexander was leaving Georgia to transfer to USC, I think it's just fair to point out, and perhaps your humble host would be in this category too, there was a little bit of angst about that, of we're kind of in a new era for transfer portal, we're in kind of a new era for NIL, Georgia's fresh off a national championship, and yet that success apparently couldn't buy Georgia enough stability to prevent what we thought was kind of a rising star on the Georgia roster from leaving Georgia and going to USC in a very high-profile way on the date of Georgia's spring game. And at the time, I think a lot of us were kind of wondering, not that the Georgia program is going to fall apart or anything like that, but some very fair and real questions of, well, man, if this can happen, if a guy like Bear, who's supposed to be the heir apparent defensive lineman for a program that had been doing nothing but producing first-round level talent at those positions, if a guy like Bear can leave just like this, then what can we say with certainty can't happen? It seems like almost anything can happen. In the age of transfer portal, in the age of NIL, that crazy stuff could be happening around every turn. And, of course, in the immediate aftermath of all that, anything is still possible, but for the most part, and the Kelly commitment yesterday kind of confirms this to be true. For the most part, the angst that some of us had about how weird the new world was and programs are really desperate to kind of bring in talent that they, perhaps had not been bringing in, the lengths they might go to try to get that talent off your roster. For the most part, most of those concerns have kind of proven to be unfounded. Not that it can't happen, but for the most part, Georgia remains business as usual, even in light of this kind of new age and new levers for coaches to pull on. For for the most part, Georgia kind of remains business as usual. It has navigated those storms, fairly effectively. But the other part of this is not just when Bear left, it sort of signaled this new age for college football that Kirby Smart was going to have to navigate. It also sort of signified a battle brewing between two coaches that are sort of always, in some respects, kind of linked together for interesting reasons. Lincoln Riley and Kirby Smart both kind of came into the head coaching ranks together. Riley had been an offensive coordinator at East Carolina, then went to Oklahoma, got promoted to head coach when Bob Stoops decided to step down. They both had pretty early, immediate success, and they actually played each other. You'll remember in Smart's second year in the Rose Bowl, in the college football playoff there at the conclusion of the 2017 season. So there's always a little bit of a linkage between Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley because of when they came in as head coaches, and also the sort of interesting contrast that one's sort of thought to be a diabolical offensive mind in Riley and the other sort of thought to be this brilliant defensive mind in Kirby Smart. There's always a little bit of a linkage there for both those guys. But when Alexander left Georgia to go to USC, it was also in the eyes of the media this start of perhaps a burgeoning recruiting war between the two coaches there as well, including a big news entity like the LA Times. They got in on this. If you're watching a video, I'll show you this to you on the screen. The headline, unmistakable. This is going back to last spring. Watch out, the LA Times says. Watch out to Kirby Smart in particular. USC is hot on the Georgia recruiting trail. So a warning to Kirby Smart from the LA Times about all the things that USC is going to try to do in recruiting to Georgia. And we've certainly seen evidence of that. And to USC's credit, they just got a UGA recruiting target committed this past weekend. They'll hold on to him at least for a little while. So it's easy to understand why the LA Times, perhaps not the most deeply connected news entity when it comes to college football, but it's sort of easy to understand why they might notice that, because you did have Justice Terry and others kind of committing to USC for a while. You did have rumors of transfers off the Georgia roster. Perhaps guys in addition to Barry Alexander, they might also consider going there too. There have been these sort of ties, these connections between Georgia and USC. From that standpoint, it's sort of easy to understand why this might have gotten the attention of the LA Times. But here's what we also know as well. It's not just sort of, kind of media entities like the LA Times who've noticed this. It certainly seems like Kirby Smart sort of noticed this too. The fact that Lincoln Riley was coming after recruits in the state of Georgia, coming after players on the Georgia roster, since you're trying to take shortcuts and get the kind of talent that Riley was, incapable of getting out of high school. A lot of, what's the phrase you sometimes hear about, poking the bear or pulling the dragon's tail or whatever else? A lot of that from USC, sort of thinking they wanted to come into Georgia's territory and try to pull talent out of the Georgia program. And I would say, and most of us think would probably agree with this, that's a fairly easy way to make an enemy out of Kirby Smart when you try to invade his turf and try to take some of the talent that Georgia either had or was expecting to get. If you make a big point of doing that and make a big show about trying to do that, of course, you're going to make an enemy out of Kirby Smart. I know that Connor Riley had a great story about this at DawgNation.com today, that being on the other side of Kirby Smart in one of these adversarial relationships is not exactly the best place to be. Paul Johnson, the former Georgia Tech coach, once found that out. He's now unemployed. Dan Mullen, the Florida coach, once found that out. He's now unemployed. A guy like Gus Malzahn once found that out too, and while Malzahn is still working, he's at UCF, he is certainly not the same level of the coaching profession he once was. All of these guys took their shot at Kirby Smart, drew Kirby Smart's ire, and Smart, in his insatiable appetite for competition, did not rest until those coaches, for the most part, were destroyed, at least in terms of the reputation they once had, incredibly tarnished after going head-to-head against Kirby Smart. And the commitment yesterday from the 2026 defensive back, Dominic Kelly, perhaps another example of that. It's not just Georgia fans who are noticing this. I saw a podcast host. Some of you may know who Jake Crane is. He's a podcast host. Maybe you know him, maybe you don't. But his opinion expressed on the X platform yesterday, perhaps, resembling what a lot of folks feel right now after the Kelly news. Jake put on the X platform, Kirby Smart isn't just shoving Lincoln Riley in a locker. He's damn near throwing him through a wall. That's what Jake Crane said. about this yesterday when it comes to Kirby Smart getting another win over Lincoln Riley and the USC Trojans. Now, listen, I could stop right here. We could laugh about this, have some fun with it. It just sort of seems like kind of a cool thing to do. We got a few more weeks before the season starts. Why not sort of invent a rivalry between Smart and Riley? And why not make an enemy out of Riley? And let's just laugh at, the ways in which he continually seemingly comes up short in this battle against Kirby Smart, with perhaps more examples to come in the future. We could have some fun with all of that. But there is something else going on here that I do think is worth your attention. Because if it is true that, whether it be from, elite defensive line prospects in this class or, transfers that Riley's tried to pull off the Georgia roster that didn't quite work out, or other targets that Georgia might go after. While it is true that Kirby Smart seemingly is getting the best of Lincoln Riley in all of this and seemingly making himself a very unfortunate enemy for Riley, answering the question of why that is, I believe, is really important. And that is not, in my mind, a rhetorical question. Why is it not just that Kirby Smart's winning these recruiting battles over Lincoln Riley and USC right now? Why is it that Smart's coaching star seems to be on the rise? If you care about the websites that rank coaches and things like that, all of them have Kirby as college football's top coach. And how could you not after 2 national championships in both 2021 and 2022? And while Kirby Smart seems to see his status ascending here right now, the truth is, once again, if you pay attention to these same kind of metrics, Lincoln Riley seems to be dropping precipitously. The reputation he once had as one of the very best coaches in college football, that's been called into question. The fact is that Riley just had the number 1 overall draft pick and a Heisman winner in Caleb Williams, and the USC program has really nothing to show for Williams' years on campus. They couldn't play defense. They just didn't have the look of a real football team during the Caleb Williams era, and fingers are being pointed at Lincoln Riley for his inability to kind of build a full program around what Riley always seems to have, which is top-notch quarterback play. And as these conversations sort of become more cemented in people's minds, Riley's status is dropping. And it's fair to point out, I mentioned the fact that Kirby and Lincoln competed against each other in 2017 in that Rose Bowl, and even though Kirby Smart won that game head-to-head, the truth is, in the years that would follow, for the most part, Lincoln Riley was treated as a better coach than Kirby Smart. He was viewed by many in the media as the sharper mind and somehow more accomplished as a coach, despite the fact he really didn't have much of a resume to point at. But I think that probably just sort of speaks to the overall bias in favor of offense over defense that sort of exists in almost every football fan's mind, and perhaps a lot of the football media there as well. But if that was ever once true, Riley being viewed as better than Kirby, now the chasm between the two coaches seems to be as wide as ever, and the recruiting wins are obviously mounting up on Kirby Smart's side there as well. And once again, it kind of points to the question of, well, why is this the case? And if you're a Georgia fan, here's the thing that you should not miss. This is, to me, what makes Kirby Smart different from Lincoln Riley, what makes Kirby Smart more accomplished than Lincoln Riley, both on the field and in recruiting. I used a phrase to describe Kirby a moment ago, sort of an insatiable appetite for competition. Smart doesn't seem to want to run from any of that. He's very comfortable competing over recruits. He's very comfortable competing on the field. In fact, while Kirby's more than happy, and he did this several times at SEC Media Days 2 weeks ago, while he's more than happy to acknowledge the fact that Georgia is playing a very tough schedule here for this year, you see no tears being shed by Kirby Smart over that. You see no complaints from Kirby Smart over that. Even though this is as tough a schedule almost as anyone's ever been asked to play, Kirby Smart seems more than happy to embrace that because that level of competition is what satisfies Kirby. He wants that. He wants to compete at the highest level. On the flip side of that, and this is not said flippantly or casually, on the flip side of that, we don't have the same kind of evidence that Lincoln Riley wants to be the same kind of competitor. You may remember there were news reports a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, that the big high-profile season opening game that USC, Riley's program, has against LSU, the game to be played in Las Vegas, there was some pretty substantial reporting by news sites that Riley wanted to cancel that game and tried everything he could to prevent his team from playing LSU, ultimately proving unsuccessful. We know on the record, Riley said this himself, that when he was asked at Big Ten Media Days last week about the ongoing series that USC has with Notre Dame, he said if he thought it would help LSU, if he thought USC, if it would help them win a national championship, he would be open to not playing Notre Dame anymore. Now imagine this. The USC program that once had Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush, all of a sudden now is afraid of playing Notre Dame or would consider not playing Notre Dame if an easier schedule made a championship more likely. That seems to be who Lincoln Riley is. Someone who doesn't embrace competition at the same level that Kirby Smart does. That's why when Riley makes an enemy out of Kirby Smart, it doesn't seem to be going well for Lincoln, because Kirby is very comfortable in a competitive environment. No matter how high the competition becomes, Smart seems to be able to find the intensity to match that. Up to this point in Lincoln Riley's coaching career, we haven't seen him be able to do the same thing. And that's why his status as a coach seems to be descending at the time that Kirby Smart seems to be ascending. And if you're a Georgia fan, that's a very good thing. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're happy to have you with us, and for me, just happy to kind of be back in the swing of things again after, as you know, kind of a long period away from work, but just sort of back running and humming here again. We're really happy about all of that. Also, so thankful for tremendous sponsors like our friends at ServPro, who make today's show possible there as well. Now, for you, there is something else that ServPro can make possible there too. If you've got a home that's got a big mess, I'm talking about fire damage, water intrusion, sort of the worst stuff you can have, well, when that mess takes place, you want it cleaned up. And really, if you could wave a magic wand over it, if you could blink your eyes and have it disappear, of course, that's what you want to do. Well, the next best thing is our friends at ServPro, because they can put it back together for you like it never even happened. Cleaned up, pristine once again. That's what their restoration specialists are all about. I love that word. Love that phrase, restoration specialists. That's what they do. They restore your property to its previous condition, and they've been doing that for folks for a long time. Residential, commercial, everything else in between. Each ServPro franchise is also independently owned and operated, which means that when you do business with ServPro, you're doing business with an organization that is just as vested into a satisfactory outcome for you as you are for yourself. And that's always a really good thing. So I want you to find them online. It's servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com for more on that. It is great to have ServPro delivering DawgNation Daily to us here today. All right, before we are done, we're going to have a fun announcement coming up in a couple of minutes about how the season opening game for Georgia against Clemson and DawgNation's involvement on all of this keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We'll tell you more about that here coming up in just a little bit. Can't wait for more on that. Also, Connor Riley stops by here in a moment there, too. As I mentioned, Connor wrote a great story about the Lincoln Riley Kirby Smart battle and the fact that Smart right now seems to be getting the best of all of that. So we'll talk to Connor about that here coming up in just a little bit. Prior to that, though, I want to go around the doghouse. And, of course, today that's presented by our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners. And had a little bit of a different experience that many of you did with SEC Media Days, because I was on Utopia of the Seas, the tremendous cruise ship from Royal Caribbean, while SEC Media Days was going on. So I wasn't consuming every morsel of information coming out of Dallas the way that the DawgNation team was, who were there and covering that on hand. I was kind of getting a lot of that either secondhand there during that week or kind of in the days since then, kind of going back and kind of consuming some of that after the fact. And I will say this, that one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the rave reviews that Nick Saban was getting and kind of some of his, I guess not quite his first broadcast work, we'll call the NFL draft that, but sort of his first sort of official act as a college football commentator at SEC Media Days in Dallas. And there was a lot of positive reviews. Saban was very present at the event. He had some kind of funny quips about not being able to get in with his security clearance, things like that. But a lot of folks were really interested in what some of the stuff that Nick Saban had to say. And this is not meant to be snarky. I'm just giving my honest impression. Because so many people were saying so many positive things about Saban, I was really keen to go back and listen to as much of that as I possibly could, because I do think that Saban's going to probably be pretty good on television, and I'm eager to hear him, because he obviously knows a lot. I mean, was eager to hear what he had to say. My personal experience and going back and listening to this was, I probably didn't think some of it was quite as good as others did. I thought a lot of it was very, very general and not very team specific. Not really getting into kind of granular detail very much, content to sort of stay kind of a 10,000-foot big picture perspective. I didn't think that Saban drilled down on some of the commentary I heard as well as others did. However, there was one quote I did see attributed to Saban. It was about Georgia that I thought was pretty interesting, where, Saban kind of talked about the one big concern he would have for Georgia right now was related to that front seven defensively, that whether or not Georgia could get back to being up front defensively what it has been in the past. That was like one example of Saban, I think, giving you some pretty specific feedback, in this case by the team we care about more than any other. And I thought that particular quote was really interesting. I read that, I guess, the other day. I thought that was really interesting. And I think one of the things that makes that somewhat interesting is the fact that it also kind of mirrors what we've talked about here on the show, that you can have a debate about Carson Beck. Is he the best quarterback in college football? You can say that Georgia's top overall strength might be its offensive line. Perhaps that's true. You can talk about some of the transfer additions that Georgia's brought in. We have high expectations for many of them. You can talk about a lot of things as it relates to Georgia. You may mention a guy like Malachi Starks, maybe among the very best players in college football, regardless of position. You wouldn't be incorrect to speak about that. That's what you chose to do. You can talk about all of these things. But as we've said many times, ultimately, we believe that Georgia's path to a national championship is going to be paved by how well it repopulates a defensive front that, if we're being honest, probably did not feel the same way in 2023 that it felt in 2021 and 2022. And the statement that Nick Saban was making about the front seven, things like that, one of the things that he's addressing there is the idea of just being a little bit more effective in the pass rush. This is something we talk about a lot around here, that when Georgia was at its best defensively, it was wreaking havoc on quarterbacks. And a year ago, probably not quite doing that quite so well. Also, maybe not quite as stout against the run as it was in the past. And so I thought, given all of that, what Nick Saban said and what we have said, looking more closely at what Kirby Smart said about his defense at SEC Media Days probably makes some sense here. And Smart was asked about the innovation that's been required from him on defense as offenses continue to evolve. And what's interesting is, I just referenced something that Saban said about Kirby. Well, in this particular answer, Kirby also references his time with Nick Saban, and in a couple of different instances also kind of bumps into the topic at hand here of making sure you are being as aggressive as you possibly can be in an intelligent way with what you have going on with your defensive front, linebackers, defensive line. So in light of all of this, can we hear Kirby Smart for a second from SEC Media Days on the ways in which he has evolved defensively and how that evolution defensively continues? Here's Kirby Smart.
You're always adapting. You have to adjust to them, but you have to dictate to them as well. If you sit back nowadays and let offenses dictate to you, they can do enough things to drive down the field and be explosive and make big plays and score quickly that it can become frustrating. You have to have ways to create negative plays. I think every defensive coach would say that. But I do think looking forward and backwards is really important. We have a relatively young defensive coordinator in Glenn Schumann who spends more time on Zooms. He loves talking football. He spends time with NFL coaches, high school coaches. Some of the best ideas we've ever gotten defensively came from great high school minds in the state that we were coaching in, because they came up with really innovative ideas, because they defend these offenses sometimes before we do. And I've always been enamored with that in-game adjustment of what we can give a kid or give a defense to help them against something they're doing. You're always reacting, but you do want to dictate at times too by the way you pressure and the things you do.
So I love that from Kirby Smart, by the way. We did kind of shorten that clip a little bit, so the reference to Nick Saban, we took that out just for the sake of time there. But two things that Kirby Smart says there I think are incredibly important for Georgia this upcoming season. It also kind of bumps into what Nick Saban said about Georgia on television. Kirby says at times you have to dictate the pace of the game by how you choose to use your pressure. I think that Smart's right about that. Now, obviously, it's always better to generate pressure with just the 4 pass rushers or something like that, but generating some action up front is imperative for a defense. Kirby says you've got to create negative plays, and sometimes I think it can be as simple as that. Now, not at the expense of giving up big plays, because if you give up more big plays as you try to create negative plays, then you essentially haven't improved your standing at all. But if you can be a stout and sound defense and also find a way to generate more negative plays like Georgia did in 2021, that's a recipe to get back to the kind of defense that's made Georgia a national champion in the past. And it's interesting to hear Kirby Smart using terms like that when he spoke to the media in Dallas 2 weeks ago. So that is Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners. Now, when Kirby Smart talks about his defense, one of the things he's talking about is making sure he doesn't put too much unnecessary risk into the equation. And our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners understand all about that, because when it comes to your retirement, the word safe, which is right in the name for our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners, we know that word probably means as much to you as anything else. You want a comfortable retirement, but you want it to kind of come with without a lot of stress and without upfront risk to you. That's what Georgia Safe Retirement Planner is all about. They offer a truly free, no-obligation retirement planning service. You get the peace of mind knowing that your future financial security is possible. And you might be able to generate more than 50% more retirement income at a fraction of the cost that you'd get if you work with somebody else. So you'll never have to worry about outliving your savings in retirement. And our friends at Georgia Safe Retirement Planners, they do this all the time. They've got all kinds of expertise when it comes to this particular field. That means they can forecast your future retirement income like 20 years into the future. They're able to kind of understand what you need now, what you will need then, and the decisions you can make right now to make sure you get there. That's what they're all about. So please find them online. It's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. That's GeorgiaSafeRetirementPlanners.com. It's great to have them as a part of Around the Doghouse, and great to know they're out there offering those free, no-obligation consultations, getting folks ready for the retirement they deserve. All right, so I told you before, we're a few minutes away from kind of a fun announcement here today that I think you're going to like. The big season kickoff event for DawgNation getting even bigger. We'll tell you about that. Also, Georgia got another commit. We'll talk about that before we're done here today. But for the topic at hand, the fun battle that seems to be brewing between Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley, and the fact that, at least for now, Smart seems to be getting the best of all of that. That plus look at everything else happening around UGA. Let's talk to Connor Riley here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Connor Riley's story this morning on Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley was terrific. And, you know, Connor, we like storylines like this. It just makes things fun for us. But this one doesn't seem to be necessarily all that manufactured. You know, there have been a lot of either near head-to-head battles, actual head-to-head battles, and it certainly seems like, and you and I are of the same mind on this, the same way a Paul Johnson or a Dan Mullen or a Gus Malzahn, these sort of more geographic rivals for Georgia, you know, coaches like that kind of drew Kirby's ire at different times over the course of recent years. You can certainly tell a fairly compelling story that Lincoln Riley has sort of done some of the same kind of stuff as of late, and we have some evidence this may be working out about as well for Lincoln as it did for the other coaches we just mentioned, right?
Yeah, on the one hand, like, I'm going to give Lincoln Riley some credit here. Kirby Smart's the best recruiting head coach in the country, and, you know, USC wants to try and turn itself around. Like, going after players that Georgia wants isn't the worst idea in the world, but I think USC and Lincoln Riley have experienced why that's maybe not necessarily the best idea there. And they also land 2026 linebacker Xavier Griffin out of Gainesville this weekend. I don't know how good people feel about the fact that he might ultimately end up at USC. And I think if we're placing bets today, I'd probably put more money that he ends up at Georgia. But it's at least interesting that these two programs who are on opposite sides of the country are not scheduled to play each other, will not play each other unless it is in a college football playoff environment, find themselves going head-to-head for so many recruits. And sure, you know, it used to be battles against Alabama and Nick Saban. And you know, the recruiting boards may be a little different from what Billy Napier has at Florida and what, say, Hugh Freeze is after at Auburn right now. But it's interesting, you know, obviously, I think these two are so tied at the hip, given the closest things to each other, except they're polar opposites.
Yeah.
Kirby Smart hired in 2016 at Georgia, Lincoln 2017 at Oklahoma, Lincoln an offensive guy, Kirby a defensive guy. And so they're sort of funhouse mirror images of each other. But since then, and specifically since Lincoln Riley took that USC job, they've gone on totally different paths. And this is a huge season for Lincoln Riley. And I think he realizes, hey, Kirby's doing at least something right, getting a certain caliber of player specifically on the defensive side of the ball. So I can't fault him for recruiting him, for trying to recruit that way. But you saw what Isaiah Gibson did. You've seen what Dominic Kelly did yesterday, committing to Georgia, flipping from USC. And we'll see how things turn out for Justice Terry and Elijah Griffin in the 2025 recruiting class. But this is going to be a continued storyline to follow, not just in this 2025 cycle, but in 2026 as well.
So this is one of those things, I could talk all day about this, because on the one hand, I'm obviously a Georgia fan, so good news for Georgia, and the Kelly commitment yesterday was certainly good news for the class of 2026. Obviously, I like this for that reason, and if you're a Georgia fan, of course you do. But the other thing that's going on here for me, and this is the kind of thing that sort of just kind of, I guess gets my juices flowing here just a little bit, is I think that Lincoln Riley and his attempt to sort of navigate what college football is right now is a much larger kind of picture of kind of where the sport is and where it's going. I think that Riley made a lot of false assumptions. I think he thought that going to L.A. and the glitz and glamour of Hollywood and the fact that USC has, a history of success, I think he deluded himself into thinking that the job at USC was going to be easier than it is. In fact, you can compare some of the things that he said recently about the actual challenges that USC is facing to some of the grandiose talk when he first took the job about how great things were going to be. And I think you see a man who perhaps didn't know what he didn't know, which is the worst trait that any leader can possibly have. I don't like Lincoln Riley. I don't respect Lincoln Riley. And it's stuff like this that that kind of caused me to sort of feel that way. This is a guy that I think thought, because L.A. sort of feels like this big glitzy city, USC sort of feels like this program that had something interesting to sell. I think that Riley tricked himself into thinking that it would be easier to have recruiting success and therefore on-field success than it's actually proven to be. And I think the mistake that he has made with some of that, like I said before, I think it stands kind of as evidence of the issues that college football has, which is, hey, you got to try. You got to put your best foot forward. Part of the issue is that we have to sort of put our thumb on the scale as a sport to sort of make the West part of this country sort of feel like they're a part of the sport the same way everybody else is, because for whatever reason they have a hard time figuring stuff out. And I would say that Lincoln Riley continues to prove he's having a hard time figuring stuff out.
You can say what you want about why Lincoln Riley left Oklahoma for USC. I absolutely believe that Oklahoma joining the SEC played a factor in that, because Oklahoma in the Big 12 was an easier job than even USC in the Pac-12 was, in terms of competition, in terms of resources available, in terms of what you had to do to go and get into a college football playoff. So in December of 2021, Lincoln Riley leaves Oklahoma to go to USC. Summer of 2022, USC and UCLA announced that they're leaving the Pac-12 and that they're joining the Big Ten. And ever since then, really, things have kind of gone off the rails for Lincoln Riley. Yes, Caleb Williams wins a Heisman Trophy, but this past year, they lose 5 games with the number 1 overall pick in the draft in Williams. And he was slow, I think, to make changes to his staff. And now you've seen him go about making those changes. And look, for my money, in terms of like a team with a wide range of outcomes this season, like USC is up there. I wouldn't be stunned if they find a way to make the playoff, because there is still a good amount of talent on that USC roster. And the bottom and middle parts of the the Big Ten aren't all that great. You could also tell me that like Lincoln Riley goes 7-6 or 6-7 this year. And I'm not saying his seat's going to get hot or anything like that, because I imagine they're paying him a good bit of money, but he's got to try to do some desperate things to turn this program around, to use your word, try. And so that's where, him getting in his recruiting battles with Georgia, it is at least interesting to me, because, for someone who I think has shown a proclivity to take an easy route, going head to head against Kirby Smart in Georgia is not something that is easy to do on the recruiting trail. And right now they're sort of showing you that. And how Georgia continues to go about recruiting and what things continue to do there, I think are going to be really interesting to see how USC continues to develop, because, right now, if things continue to go poorly, by the time these 2026 kids, we've talked about Xavier Griffin out of Gainesville, Dominic Kelly out of IMG Academy, like if things continue to go poorly for Lincoln Riley, he could well not be the coach by the time those guys get on campus.
Let me ask you, I guess, before we move off this topic. So we might say that Riley tried to make himself a chief recruiting rival for Georgia, and thus far it's not really working all that well. It's not that he doesn't have any wins, as you mentioned. They got the linebacker commit this past weekend, but we sort of assume a guy like that might not stick. It seems like it's not working out too well for Riley right now, trying to make himself a chief recruiting rival to UGA. So if you were Georgia right now, if Riley's not it, who is going to be the program out there that causes Georgia the most concern on the recruiting trail? If I forced you to answer that right now, who might be capable of doing what Lincoln Riley is proving incapable of doing?
Well, so one, I think recruiting has changed so much because of NIL that some of the regionalness has changed a little bit, and you've seen certain programs be willing to spend, and that has thus expanded their footprint there. I think you look at, say, an Ohio State program, since specifically they hired Ross Bjork as their athletic director. Yeah. They have opened up the purse strings there a little bit, but I think the team that jumps out to me right now, maybe it's just a prisoner of the moment thing, but he's a relatively new coach to this current iteration of the SEC, and I trust his recruiting acumen a lot more than I trust Kalen DeBoer's. And that's Hugh Freeze at Auburn. And they're going in a lot of in-state guys right now, and it's a very good high school state, Alabama. I think one of the under talked about things about Nick Saban and what he's done in his time at Alabama is he's just raised the quality and the caliber of athlete to come out of the Alabama high school program, and the infrastructure there, I think, has raised the recruiting profile in that state. And as we've seen of late here, because Kalen DeBoer, and you look at that Alabama recruiting class, so much of it is coming from the West Coast and the West Coast ties that Kalen DeBoer had in his time at Washington and even Fresno State before that. Hugh Freeze is leaning on those in-state connections. And, like we've sort of seen Bruce Pearl do with Auburn basketball, they had a ton of success recruiting the Atlanta area. I think it's only a matter of time before Hugh Freeze turns his attention from, okay, we're doing really well in the state of Alabama now. Let's go into Georgia and see if we can't get some of those high caliber athletes, not just from the metro Atlanta area where everyone gets from, but those South Georgia athletes, those Zayden Walker types, moving forward, what do those guys look like as Auburn, I think, continues to build out a quality program? I think that this is a team, while it might not necessarily reflect it on the field this year in terms of win-loss record, I think it's a program that is making the steps to improving and becoming a more chief rival to Georgia, at least on the recruiting front. Auburn has a long way to go in terms of consistently beating Georgia on the field. I believe off the top of my head, they have 3 wins dating back to 2005 against Georgia. It has not been a competitive rivalry in that sense. But in terms of what they can do on the recruiting trail, if everything is aligned at Auburn, which is a big if given the history of that program, Hugh Freeze is the type of guy that we've seen even going back to the Mark Richt era at when Freeze was at Ole Miss, can make waves on the recruiting trail. So right now, if there's a guy, maybe not today, but down the road a little bit that can give Georgia some issues, I do give it to Hugh Freeze.
I think it's a really interesting answer. I would also add to that, Connor, that the one thing I've tried to say a lot during this offseason without making too much about it, but I sort of don't feel like we're talking enough about Tennessee, both the game that Georgia's going to play this fall. I think that in the month of November, if I had to guess, the game against Tennessee will end up being bigger than the road game against Ole Miss. Now, listen, I've been wrong about Ole Miss before. Maybe I'm wrong about this here right now. But because Georgia has handled Tennessee easily on the field during the Josh Heupel era, I think that people have kind of pushed Tennessee aside because there are obviously games on Georgia's schedule this year that are bigger than Tennessee is. But Tennessee is still getting its share of recruiting wins. Some of those, at least in some form or fashion, sort of come against Georgia. I know there'll be a factor for Juan Gaston moving towards the weekend here too, or whether they get that or not. Tennessee is still a hat on the table for a lot of guys. They're winning their share of recruiting battles. I think some of the NIL stuff sometimes gets exaggerated, but Tennessee probably has some of that figured out than some of Georgia's other SEC rivals certainly have it figured out. I think that we may be guilty here of acting like that Tennessee is as more bound than some of these other SEC programs when either on the field or in recruiting, it's just clearly not.
No, and I agree with you in that sense. And I think you acknowledge the reason why, at least currently, I think some Georgia fans are willing to overlook Tennessee. And it's just because every time they've played since Heupel's gotten there, it has been uncompetitive. And look, we've talked ourselves going into that game every year of, in 21 and 23, that's a road game. It's going to be a tough environment. And that just proved to not be the case. Georgia really dropped the hammer on Tennessee's face and Neyland both times there. I can't believe Tennessee put forth that kind of an effort in front of Dolly Parton that day. And then in 2022, everyone was talking up Tennessee. People were picking Tennessee. People were saying Tennessee was going to score 50 on Georgia. And Georgia, in a game that the final score doesn't reflect, and this is why it's important to continue to talk about these things, that was an absolute curb stomping that day. And so because it's so uncompetitive, look, Josh Heupel has done a great job of raising the floor of this Tennessee program, especially from the mess that he inherited from Jeremy Pruitt. And they've continued to add good players. They've been a factor in the Metro Atlanta recruiting area. More recently, they landed a guy like Christian Gass that Georgia really did want there at the end. Until I see Josh Heupel schematically make things a little bit tougher for Kirby Smart, for Georgia, I'm just going to be dubious that this is going to be a team that, even as they get more talented, and look, there's talent on this year's team. Squirrel White, James Pierce, Cooper Mays. There are a lot of good players on this Tennessee team this year. Would not shock me if we're there in late November and we're talking about that November 16th game as like, hey, Tennessee's got to at least try and keep this close to keep their playoff hopes alive and playoff discussion alive. But because schematically Georgia has just so figured out what Heupel does, I just find it hard to see them ever getting it at least to a point where they can consistently beat Georgia, much less keep it close at this point in time.
I want to talk to you about SEC Media Days are coming up in a moment. Before that, though, let me remind some folks, I told you we want to make a fun announcement. So we've been telling you for a while about our DawgNation Invasion kickoff event against Clemson to begin the 2024 season. Right there in downtown Atlanta, you knew we'd have a big event. Of course, we're going to. Our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips, kind of in partnership with us here for this year. They're kind of helping us power these tailgates. That's going to be a lot of fun. You know, it's breakfast themed this year because the Georgia-Clemson game is the noon start. That means we've got like the bacon, the eggs, the sausage, the pastries, the muffins, all that kind of stuff, plus mimosas, Bloody Marys. You want the beer, the wine, the traditional stuff, you can get that too. But kind of a fun breakfast-themed event around that this year because of the early start. Also, for the first 250 that sign up, you are going to get your DawgNation Invasion t-shirt for that big game in Atlanta to begin the season. So we've already been telling you about that. That is going to be a lot of fun. And if you haven't gotten your tickets for that already, you need to go to DawgNation.com/tailgate for more. That's DawgNation.com/tailgate to get in for the big DawgNation Invasion event in Atlanta to kick off the season against Clemson. But here's what's new. We haven't told you about this yet, but it's going to be an incredible time. You know our friends, obviously, in the Dunwoody area where we are each and every day. Obviously, we tell you about Discover Dunwoody all the time and the great travel option they are for folks who are coming to the Atlanta area for whatever reason you might be coming in, including to kick off the season for the Georgia game against Clemson. We're going to offer you a stay and play package here, which includes a one-night stay at the Hyatt Place Perimeter Center, beautiful hotel right here in the Dunwoody area, really convenient. We're also going to give you a round-trip transportation from the hotel to this tailgate game and back in a luxury motor coach. That's going to be a ton of fun. Now, in addition to this, you get the tickets to the DawgNation Invasion tailgate, and you get the DawgNation Atlanta Sports Trip swag bag that goes along with this there too, which includes, obviously, the DawgNation Invasion t-shirt. So if you want to kind of plush your experience for the DawgNation Invasion kickoff, season kickoff tailgate there in Atlanta, how about the stay and play package from Discover Dunwoody that includes a wonderful night stay that right there at the terrific hotel, the Hyatt Place Perimeter Center. You can enjoy the convenient access that Dunwoody provides to Atlanta downtown on the luxury motor coach and really just enjoy a wonderful part of the Atlanta area right here. And, of course, we're always encouraging you, if you're coming downtown or into the Atlanta area for any reason, if you're looking for a good, affordable option, a hotel that gives you sort of a safe, family-friendly environment with plenty of restaurant options, plenty of dining and shopping options, Dunwoody is certainly an example of that. So Discover Dunwoody, now involved with our DawgNation Invasion tailgate in Atlanta, offering the stay and play package, terrific night stay, luxury motor coach transportation to and from. Make it a great weekend with our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips and Discover Dunwoody. Go to atlsportstrips.com to find out more about that. So that's going to be a lot of fun. All right, Connor, back to the topic of Georgia football here just for a moment. Obviously, I was not a part of the SEC Media Days festivities, having a great time on board Utopia of the Seas. But as I mentioned a moment ago, I've tried to go back and sort of relive as much of that as I could, having missed it live at the time. And to me, it sort of seems like, I guess, a subdued version of SEC Media Days in comparison to a couple of years ago when the big bombshell dropped that Texas and Oklahoma were coming into the league, or perhaps some of these years in which Georgia's been facing this like really big question related to quarterback or something like that. You know, this just seemed to be a little bit less eventful of an SEC Media Days. You were there. Is that the takeaway you had from having covered it live?
Yeah, I guess everything is bigger in Texas except for SEC Media Days, it seems. I think that from a Georgia perspective, because I was only there for 25 hours. I was in and out of Dallas, Texas. Too hot there for my liking. I think for Georgia, it was a very, I think, toned down Kirby Smart. And obviously, I think the timing impacted some of that. The week prior, there had been more driving arrests for Georgia. And, it was hard for, I think, Kirby to come in there with the bravado and the big thumping speech there. Look, I think Kirby knows that this is a place where, yes, certain years your message can sort of pierce through and get and reach people, reach fans, but there was just so much else going on there this year. Texas and Oklahoma joining the league. New Alabama coach Kalen DeBoer. You had Nick Saban there, who was, I think, a main attraction at SEC Media Days this year because it was his first time there. And I think a lot of people were interested in how he was going to do as an analyst. There was a lot of, I think, pomp and circumstance that sort of overshadowed the Georgia program in particular there. And I think Kirby sort of definitely read the room and said, all right, we don't need to make any bigger deal of this than it needs to be. And so we'll just sort of go about our day. We'll try and keep as many headlines limited as we can. And for the most part, that is what they did. And I think as someone who follows this program, I'm more than okay with that. I think that there's this weird maybe disconnect between how some people out there see media days and what it is. And there are people that legitimately get excited for it. And I have no issues with that. But I think in a larger sense, like this is the sort of thing that doesn't matter. And as it has gotten bigger and bigger as this year it did in Texas, I think Kirby sort of recognizes, hey, like we don't need to go out there and push everything in and be the best versions of ourselves and look the best, be the best, et cetera, win SEC Media Days. I think he knows that it's far more important to win games on the field than to win press conferences and wherever this traveling circus ends up.
Let me say one more thing about all of this. I don't know if you feel the same way that I do. I think that the preseason conversation has suffered. I love talking season. I talk for a living, so I like talking about college football. I typically love the sort of talking season time of year. I think the preseason chatter has suffered this year from the fact that we have so much newness coming to the upcoming season. I don't think we quite yet properly know how to talk about it because we haven't seen it. We probably haven't had anything like this since 2014 when the college football playoff was introduced for the very first time. But even this is more different than that because, there is no SEC East to win anymore. That's different. We don't quite know exactly how many SEC teams are going to make the playoff. It could be 3, maybe it's 4. We don't quite know other, kind of non-Big Ten, non-SEC teams, how many of them are going to be taken seriously here. Texas and Oklahoma are going to make the SEC feel different in ways we probably can't properly articulate as of yet. Do you sense the same thing that I do, which is that the kind of previous conversation we would have had in the preseason are a little bit harder to conjure up here right now because we're having to anticipate some things that we don't exactly know how they're going to look and feel until we actually see them play out.
Yeah, be it fans, media, I think even coaches in some regard, because we don't know what a 12-team playoff is going to look like, what a 16-team SEC will look like. We don't really know how to talk about this stuff yet, or at least find what matters and what doesn't. And so, there are a lot of talking around the idea of, 17-game schedule is a possibility there. Travel concerns, NIL, all this stuff that, while yes, it's about the game of football, it is not really about the finer points of the team. You're not getting Kirby Smart giving in-depth breakdowns on what Carson Beck is going to be able to do this year, what Michael Williams' position switch is going to look like in these big settings. And so because of that, because there are so many, I think, national talking points that are new this year, you're not getting the same intensity that it comes to specifically talking about a Georgia, talking about an Alabama, et cetera. And so hopefully this is just a one-year thing, but I do sort of start to wonder as we enter this new age of the sport, maybe this is just the way that it is going forward, where SEC Media Days is sort of a thing of the past where it's, that weird in-between stage of, not exactly full-blown social media, but there was some social media there. And it's just become so big and so unwieldy now that the thing we all grew up loving and some of the quirks about SEC Media Days that we liked are just sort of gone by the wayside as we try and figure out how even it exists in the new context of college football.
Really quick before I let you go, and I've kept you very long, and I apologize for that. You mentioned Kirby having some issues with some of the traffic stuff as they were at SEC Media Days. Kirby's also going to speak on Thursday as Georgia begins fall camp. Given the newness of the Ra Thomas situation, and the fact that's relatively fresh coming on this past weekend. How much of like the non-football part of this is going to cloud Georgia's kickoff to fall camp when it takes place on Thursday?
Not aside from the rah-rah stuff, not a ton. I think he's spoken his piece on the driving-related incidents. I thought, and unfortunately it doesn't play out because this was in a small room media session. I thought he gave very strong and stern answers when it comes to that and what Georgia is going about doing to try and curb some of that moving forward. Obviously, we'll wait and see what happens specifically with Small Monday and with Trevor Etienne moving forward. As far as the driving stuff, I don't expect a ton of questions on that on Thursday, maybe one or two, but I think that's maybe perhaps part of a larger team culture-wide discussion. The Ra Thomas thing, Kirby is going to have to provide some answers for. And obviously, look, he's going to say that this is an ongoing legal investigation and there's only so much that they can say there. But at the same point in time, this is Thomas's second arrest in terms of family violence there. He is indefinitely suspended from the team. And so I think in some way, Kirby is at least going to have to provide some answers, at least as into why you brought Thomas in the first place and why you continue to keep him here after this first arrest. Now, knowing that this second arrest has happened, I'm not expecting Kirby to say this is a dismissal, we're moving on from this. But I do think that in some way, the Thomas arrest now opens up, I think, some larger doors to team culture, because I think I am maybe more sympathetic than most national media members, or at least most media members. I don't want to conflate myself as a national media member when it comes to what exactly Kirby Smart can do when it comes to some of the driving stuff, because at the end of the day, these are 18 to 22-year-olds who are given very fast cars, and that's just what 18 to 22-year-olds do. I think this Thomas situation is a lot different, in my opinion, in terms of what Kirby is able to control, in terms of what Kirby sort of allows to have happen here. And so because of that, I think that this is an issue more so than the driving one, that I'm going to be looking for real answers from Kirby Smart on this, or at least substantial ones that address the concerns that have risen since the Ra Thomas arrest.
Connor, great stuff. We appreciate all your insight here today. Looking forward to reading a lot from you as Georgia begins fall camp here this week. There'll certainly be plenty of fun conversation to be had in the weeks to come. So thanks for being here for that. We'll talk to you very soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by SurfPro.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Good stuff.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so fall camp getting going on Thursday. I think Connor's right. You know, there'll be obviously some necessary discussion about the Ra Thomas thing, but, you know, it certainly seems like Georgia's moved pretty swiftly on that. You've got the suspension here. You know, obviously, you know, Georgia's seemingly not taking that lightly, but it is a serious situation because it's as we said yesterday, sort of the second time that Ra Thomas has been kind of tied into a situation that feels very, very similar here. So that will obviously be a hot topic on Thursday, but also plenty of football stuff there and all of that there as well. Speaking of football stuff, we're going to get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, but still looking back and having some fun about my experience on Utopia of the Seas not long ago. I think tomorrow I'm going to show you something on video you're going to really love. This is going to be a great time. I continue to reflect on what an amazing experience that was. You know, they're building Utopia of the Seas like the world's biggest weekend, because a lot of the sailings are those 3-night sailings where you kind of leave on a Friday, you go through a weekend. And, you know, when you see right here this video, if you're watching on video, this is called Utopia Station. So what they're basically doing is they have a restaurant concept called the Royal Railway, where, I mean, this is like being in a theme park or something like that, where this part of the ship is sort of designed, and I had a chance to tour this and see this myself. It's designed to be like a rail car. And I wondered, you know, can you make this feel like an actual train on a cruise ship? And they really have. I mean, you're seeing it right there on video. The when you're sitting in there, and it's shaking and it's kind of bouncing and rattling the way that a train should. And obviously the cool view kind of outside on all of that. There's a show component that goes with that there too. And over the course of time, you know, they're going to kind of transition this for like holidays and Halloween and things like that. But you're talking about just an absolutely amazing experience, and Royal Caribbean really kind of theming this to the absolute max. And there's nobody that does the family vacation, I think, better than Royal Caribbean does, and Royal Railway, the perfect example of that. So if you want to have your own experience on board Utopia of the Seas, if you want to join us on the DawgNation cruise in April of 2025, Jessica Slater, the great travel agent, the one to know for all that, you can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and she can talk to you about all of that. Yeah, so Royal Railway, an incredible experience on board Utopia of the Seas, and just one of many things that makes that such a wonderful experience. All right, cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean for a moment. There was something else from SEC Media Days that I want to look back on here for a moment. You know, we have seen a lot of chatter related to teams other than Georgia here thus far this season. There's the talk of Ohio State, you know, the fact that they're kind of in a sort of a win now mode. There's clearly a lot of attention about Texas coming into its first year in the SEC. As of late, there's been a lot of chatter about Kalen DeBoer and what he can do in his first year at Alabama. But the one thing we kind of always knew would be the case is that while the unofficial stuff, the talking head, the social media chatter, things like that, while it might fixate on like the Texases and the Alabamas or the Ohio States, the actual official predictions and the sort of more, gambling-oriented predictions where you have to put your money where your mouth is, all of that was always destined to be heavily weighted in favor of Georgia. Now, this is not necessarily a guarantee how the season plays out, but when I did go back and look at SEC Media Days, something that I missed live at the time, when it comes to the actual overall predictions of who is going to win the SEC, I thought it was pretty amazing just how wide the gap was between Georgia and the team that we probably assume would be second when it comes to Texas. The overall points for order of finish had, you know, Georgia at 33-30 and Texas at 3,041. But the actual first place votes between the two teams, huge difference here, where Georgia got 165 first place votes from the media that was assembled. Texas getting just 27, well ahead of Alabama, who was next on the list at just 12. And after that, you got, you know, Ole Miss getting 4. You know, there's always a couple of dorks who vote for Vanderbilt, and then, you know, on and on you go. But the point is that when you look at the teams who were legitimately believed to have a chance here, Bama, who won it a year ago, Texas, who was in last year's college football playoff, Georgia, who's a fixture in these kinds of things, the actual official predictions here still favor Georgia by an incredibly wide margin. Now, this would have also been true a year ago, too. As we said yesterday, Georgia had 11 first-team preseason All-SEC picks a year ago and ultimately didn't win the SEC. But it's still something probably kind of important just to sort of note and file away that for all of the talk about teams other than Georgia, when it's time to get official, when it's time to let the, air quotes here, professionals make their predictions, Georgia is as heavily favored in this conference as it has ever been, even in light of the new look SEC. Now, speaking of the All-SEC team, we talked about this yesterday. Georgia did get 6 players on the first team of the preseason All-SEC. To me, there's a big difference between being a first-team guy and sort of a second, third-team guy. It's the program that has the most first-team guys that I generally sort of favor as, just the best team in the league. If you want to be the best team, you have to have a collection of the best players. And I think first-team All-SEC status probably measures that as about as well as anything else does. However, I wanted to talk about some of the non-Georgia stuff here for a moment. And this is not all that relevant for UGA because Georgia doesn't play this team, at least in the regular season. But you see, unsurprisingly, Luther Burden coming in on this list, wide receiver from Missouri. This is a team, especially if you want to go back to the winter months, it seems like there's probably more of that then than there is now. Missouri was getting some real legitimate chatter as a college football playoff team. They obviously got a big bowl win last year against Ohio State. They were legitimately a very good team. And you certainly stand to believe their fortunes this year with, obviously, Brady Cook at quarterback, but their fortunes this year are going to be heavily tied into how well Luther Burden plays, what he can possibly do to really be the most dynamic offensive force in the SEC if he could be that. Could be one of those interesting stories where this guy, at times over the course of his first couple of years on campus, this has been the case, but at times sort of has that look of almost being unguardable. You got to imagine if Missouri really does take that next step, you need a much bigger year from Burden on that. We'll see if he's able to get it. Quinn Ewers was the second team All-SEC quarterback. As we've said before, and Jake Fromm and I have talked about this in the past, kind of an interesting, kind of a swing there between, does Ewers hold off Arch Manning for the full year? Does he take the step of sort of being the kind of quarterback he could be? There's obviously a huge head-to-head battle looming between I should say between Ewers and Carson Beck when you get to the late part of the middle part of the season. Looking on defense for a moment, I'll mention this. We talked about Tennessee a moment ago. I think one of the things that we know about Tennessee is with Josh Heupel as the head coach, they've been pretty good offensively against teams other than Georgia, but they haven't really been a full, complete team as of yet. A guy like James Pierce, who you sometimes see mentioned as a likely very high first-round draft pick in next spring's NFL draft. That's a guy who also gets a first-team All-SEC nod. That's an example of maybe, Tennessee trying to be a little more complete on defense to sort of match what they have been able to do offensively. Walter Nolan from Ole Miss also gets the selection there, first-team preseason All-SEC. This is one of the things that's going to try to make Ole Miss different this year, and one of the reasons why. Maybe Ole Miss has a chance to be closer with Georgia this time than it was a year ago, not just because the game's in Oxford, but because they've obviously tried to take big steps towards getting their lines of scrimmage figured out. We'll see if that's indeed the case. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, I've got one more note on the Georgia Bulldogs to give you before we wrap up here today. Let me also give a quick shout out to our friends at Mr. Electric before we do that. They're DawgNation's choice for your residential electrical needs, also commercial needs there as well. They take safety very, very seriously. Obviously, when it comes to anything related to your electricity, clearly that's what you want to do. They're all about that, but they're also all about providing great service for you there as well. Got a team of licensed experts. They're insured. They got the upfront flat rate pricing. Cost certainty is always really important when it comes to stuff like this. So whether it's 24-hour emergency service or you just want to quote on some work you want to get done, our friends at Mr. Electric got you covered on all of that. And there's a $29 service fee that's waived anytime you get some repair work done. So they're a neighborly company. We want you to reach out to them today. Request your quote. It's MrElectricAtlanta.com. That's MrElectricAtlanta.com. All right, one more recruiting note to give you here today. You may have read about this at DawgNation.com yesterday. Georgia bringing in a very interesting prospect for the class of 2025. JJ Hanne is his name. He's a defensive lineman, resident of the state of California right now by way of Germany, where he lived a long time there in Berlin. This is a guy who brings a heavy international flavor to this UGA roster, but also, a little bit like some of what we've talked about, past maybe with a guy like Josh Jackson, something like that. One of these sort of intriguing prospects where Georgia, because it takes care of so much of its recruiting business, working way ahead, also has a chance to be a little experimental when it perhaps wants to as well. And maybe in some cases, that's what Hanny's going to be. He's obviously not a very highly rated prospect here right now, but thought to have a very high upside. And as he's camped at Georgia and visited with Georgia, seems to be, as a football prospect, continuing to improve here on a fairly regular basis. I thought that Jeff Sintel had an interesting quote from Hanne in his story there at DawgNation.com about his emergence as a player, saying, I've gotten a lot better, just actually being more violent and confident in myself. Just looking at the tape, I wasn't playing with confidence and able to do this, but now I know that I belong. To be blessed with an offer from Georgia and committing there, that means you've got to be a dog. He says, I'm just looking forward to this season and showing the world why I'm committed to Georgia. So obviously this is a player that sort of understands that he is in kind of a developmental phase of his life as a player. And for Georgia, that sells development so well anyway, you got to imagine a player like this probably sees the value in that maybe more so than others, because as someone who's, just got a very different football background, he knows how much he needs that development. But when Georgia sets its sights on players like this, no one seems to scout better than the Dogs do. And when they make an unorthodox decision, oftentimes that has a way of paying out. And playing it in a positive way for Georgia here right now. So you can read more about this at DawgNation.com. Jeff had a story yesterday. Got a story coming up here today there as well. Really fun and interesting stuff as Georgia adds an intriguing prospect from the class of 2025. And speaking of Jeff Sintel, also later this afternoon on the DawgNation, probably the best way to watch this on the DawgNation YouTube page. If you saw my tell-all interview with Kaylee Manziel while I was gone, the latest example of that also drops today there as well. Jeff's got a really interesting backstory, how he came to be a guy here at DawgNation, a part of this continuing series we have for you, learning a little bit more about the folks you see behind the scenes and on camera and everything else. Kaylee Manziel with Jeff Sintel for a DawgNation tell-all. I believe that's 4 p.m. this afternoon for that there on the DawgNation video channels, including DawgNation YouTube page. Hope you will check that out today. All right, as we wrap up, I want to give a little family shout out for our golden shoe here today. My cousin's son, my cousin is Jessica, her son is Thomas. Thomas is getting ready to have his first child, going to be named Lucy. And talk about great stuff here. Jessica shared this with me. I wanted to share this. So this is Lucy's, I guess you'll say first, do you call these onesies? Is that what these are called? The first Georgia onesie for Lucy here. It says, "Can I get a woof woof, Dawg Nation?" That's great stuff. So I'm so proud from Thomas and my family there on that. So happy for my cousin Jessica. Another great dog fan on the way here. And we're always very, very happy about good news like that. So golden shoe worthy indeed for a really cool outfit for the soon-to-be-born Lucy here. That is a lot of fun. How about the lousy, stinking Gators? No fun for them. 1,361 days. That's how long it's been since they have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That's our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right, so yesterday we were not able to do a ton of comments, and I told you today we'd come back and do those. I want to make good on that promise here today. I do apologize for that. I told this for our video on it earlier. I don't talk a lot about my probably my personal life on here. We just, we try to keep Georgia football as the star of the show, I guess, if you will. But we've had so much going on. Oh my gosh, it's been such a crazy time in our family. One of these days, I'll tell you all about that. But today we're going to settle in, we're going to relax, and we're going to sort of find out what's on your mind because it's been a while since we've had a chance to do all of this. Taylor Russell says the Brandon Adams tell-all would be sponsored by Royal Caribbean. Well, listen, I would certainly hope so because I'm a big fan of our friends at Royal Caribbean, to be sure. Let's see what else. Let's see what's going on. I know a lot of folks are arguing with our buddy G. Grace. It's kind of fun to know that the more things change, the more they stay the same. After a couple of weeks away, folks are still in here arguing with G. Grace. G also says, I might design a ship one day. I'm an expert here at this point. Well, listen, I feel like the folks at Royal Caribbean are doing a pretty good job of designing their ships right now. But if they ever want some feedback, some input from me, I will be happy to share all of that. Let's see what else. Dogs rolling loud says, I'm sure that Ra will be dismissed from the team. I imagine that's probably the case. As I said yesterday, I don't mind telling you, and I don't care if this is, what some people would disagree with. I'm not going to live in fear of PR fallout, so-called bad look. I am unconcerned with a bad look. And I would advise not just Georgia's coaches to be this way. I'd advise all coaches to be this way, that when it comes to football as an agent of change, football as a mechanism for making men, I want to take football away from a player as a last resort. That's not just a self-serving thing because I want Georgia to have good players. I would say that for Billy Napier at Florida, for Josh Heupel at Tennessee, for Hugh Freeze at Auburn, for Kalen DeBoer at Alabama. We don't have a track record of, making a big deal every time, some sort of player from some sort of program runs afoul of the law. We've got too much content we can do from making too big of even some fairly big deals. We, for the most part, have kind of sidestepped. And, when I'm not going to cite examples here, but there are a lot of things involving other programs that we could have made a much bigger deal about. We just didn't really do. So I want to take football away from a player as a last resort, but you also have to make judgment calls sometimes. And if I was the leader of an organization, and if I saw someone appear to make the same mistake twice, at least allegedly, something that sort of feels like the same error again, well, that would be something that would cause an alarm to go off within my judgment. And from that standpoint, my best judgment, from, however many miles away, outside looking in, my best judgment call is that moving on from Ra Thomas is probably the right thing to do. So I imagine that's probably what will happen. Let's see what else. Taylor Russell, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. Michael Moore on the subject between a personal rivalry between Lincoln Riley and Kirby Smart. Yeah, we talked about that a little bit off the top of the show. It certainly appears that way to me, for sure. This seems like, I don't really know what Kirby's actual personal feelings are for Riley. When you look at the kinds of guys we've sort of assumed that Kirby had a rivalry with in the past on a personal basis, there's certain aspects of Lincoln Riley that sort of feel like they're at least somewhat similar in that respect too, right? DT says Quinn Ewers all hat, no cattle. I mean, we'll see about that. Like, I think I've said this before. I thought that Quinn Ewers made some really big throws in Texas's win against Alabama in one of the bigger games of last season. I thought in that college football playoff game against Michael Penix in Washington, I didn't think he looked special at all. So there is a version of Ewers that could be one of the best quarterbacks in the country. And there's also a version of Ewers that has a hard time keeping Arch Manning on the bench all year long. And I agree with what some other people have said too, which is that Manning may be good enough. Ewers may be unspectacular enough that even if Manning doesn't completely overtake Ewers for the job, in kind of a Tim Tebow style in 2006, maybe Manning is getting a decent amount of playing time before it's all said and done. Let's see what else. Senior Dog 54 on the subject of being additional details of the Ra Thomas story. Yeah, no doubt. I assume that could certainly be the case. Oftentimes that is. And if I'm Ra Thomas, you better believe I'm using every aspect of the legal system to my benefit. At least I'm going to try to. You have a right to defend yourself. And if I'm Ra Thomas, that's what I'm going to do. And, I don't think that, the Georgia coaches should, be so concerned about sending a strong message. They don't do their due diligence on this as well. I mean, ultimately, there is no more tired topic for me than the idea of coaches doling out punishment. I'm just not that interested in that as a topic. There are times when it's necessary, but ultimately, if bad behavior isn't punished enough, I would say more times than not, your beef with law enforcement and the legal system than it is with the coaching system, for sure. Randy Hall wondering with the stay and play package, do you get an autographed picture of BA? I don't know about that. Randy Hall also mentioning that Tennessee's last 3 commits are coming from the state of Georgia. Yeah, I mean, like Georgia had, let me see if I can say it this way, because I was trying to think about how I wanted to say this. Georgia has dominated Tennessee. We don't dispute that. But I don't believe that domination has been a total, obliteration? I don't think Georgia's domination of Tennessee has been a total obliteration. They have been humbled, but they haven't been completely dispatched. They're still a factor. Now, they had the advantage with Christian Gass's recruitment in the fact they could sell, we need you more than Georgia needs you. And I'm sure that's probably a pretty effective pitch. But Georgia wanted Christian Gass. There's no doubt about that, and Tennessee still got it. I really like Mike Matthews a lot. That's obviously the kind of player that Tennessee seems to have an ability to recruit that's still pretty tough for Georgia. For all the talk about Josh Heupel and quarterback, I don't know that he's had the truly special guy yet. Is Nico Iamaleava going to be that for him this year? If that's the case, then, that gives Heupel a chance to kind of further cement himself a little bit. I do think that, if I try to take my Georgia fan hat off and put my just sort of objective analyst hat on to the extent that I can even do that, I do think that Tennessee is one of the more interesting teams in the SEC this year. Randy Hall also shouting out the gymnast from Rockmart, who I guess was it silver medal. Is that what he won? You know, I've told y'all before, I can't pretend to be something that I'm not. And in real life, I don't care about the Olympics at all. At all. I mean, I liked the 92 Dream Team back in the day, but I'm just not into the Olympics. My daughter, I think, will want to watch some gymnastics at some point in time, and hopefully I'm able to do that with her. But I'm just not into the gymnastics. So if I'm shortchanging a UGA athlete who's there, it's not being done on purpose, but I also can't and I'm happy for them when they do well, and I guess I love our country and happy when it does well. But in terms of caring about the Olympics, I'm not going to pretend to be something that I'm not. I really don't care that much about it. But Jimmy at Gigi's, I don't know the answer to that, Jimmy. I don't think that should have changed. I'm not sure. I don't think that's different. Yeah, I'll have to ask about that. I don't think that's different. I mean, I think I'm looking at it right now, Jimmy. I'm not sure. Zach Adams says he's ready to see what London Humphreys can do. Yeah, I think that Humphreys is an interesting guy. You know, I don't know how he fits into the pecking order for this year. Keep in mind, he's still a really young guy. But there were only a couple of freshman receivers that made any impact whatsoever in the SEC a year ago. The Wilson kid from Florida was one, and Humphreys from Vanderbilt was the other. So, I mean, Humphreys has not gotten a lot of attention, although weirdly he did get called out in, like, I think it was the Lindy's college football preview. But I do think that Humphreys is, I mean, by bringing him in, you can make a case that you brought in one of the best freshman receivers in the SEC last year. Let's see what else. Kent Holcomb, happy to see Jorge Soler coming back to Atlanta. I guess Luke Jackson is too. Trying to make some trade deadline moves here. Matt Rukavin also mentioning the rugby team. I did see the one viral video of the one girl doing like the Derrick Henry stuff. That was pretty wild. Let's see what else. Matthew Dill says, I believe that Kirby is as capable of handling disciplinary issues as any other aspect of the organization personally. Yeah, I agree with that too. Like, there is no, because here's the thing. Georgia fans don't want to be embarrassed by the Georgia program. So even though that most of us get tired of talking about these negative stories fairly quickly, there is still this hope among most Georgia fans that, you know, stuff like this doesn't materialize because you don't want to be embarrassed by your team. That's just sort of a natural reaction. But understanding that as the desired outcome, you know, Georgia to avoid as many bad headlines as possible. Understanding that as the desired outcome, I absolutely trust Kirby Smart implicitly to be able to do that. Absolutely. And I think it's important to note this, is that there's a certain kind of confidence required in a situation like this because, as I mentioned the other day when we were talking about whoever it was we were talking about the other day, they had whatever, you know, all these things kind of run together for me after a while. Like if Georgia like announced tomorrow or announced today that's kicking Ra Thomas off the team. Ra is gone. We're kicking him off the team. There is not one season projection for Georgia that would change at all. And Ra's a pretty good player, I think. At least he has a chance to be. But Georgia's season win total wouldn't change. There's not a single point spread for Georgia, one of these individual games that would change. Its odds of making the playoff or winning the SEC or certainly winning the national championship would not change at all. That from a measurable statistical standpoint, Ra Thomas makes no impact on Georgia winning or losing. And the gambling odds are the best proof that you need of that. They would not move at all if Georgia moved away from Ra Thomas. So in other words, it would be fairly cost-free for Kirby Smart to grandstand and say, we're not tolerating this kind of behavior. We're kicking Ra Thomas off the team. Kirby Smart could score some easy, cheap points in the public relations war just by doing that here right now without impacting his team on the field really at all. And so the fact that they're doing it more deliberately suspended indefinitely, learning the facts of the situation. For me personally, I'd take that as a good sign that this is someone who's trying to exert what I would describe as real leadership and not just knee-jerk reaction to whatever's going to move the headlines in one direction or the other. Not everybody agrees with that, and I'm totally fine, but I don't view myself to be any less right because perhaps the majority of people, certainly outside the bubble of DawgNation, perhaps feel differently. Let's see what else. Winfred Steinspring, also not a fan of the Olympics. This is just one of those things where when I was younger, like say pre-kids, my oldest is 12. When I was younger, man, I was watching every sport all the time. I just sort of feel like I knew everything about every sport. It sort of feels that way anyway. As you get older, you have less time, just matter-of-factly. But also, I think you feel less of a need to explore things that you don't just really, really love. Like one of the cool things about getting older, and, if you're younger than me, please know that I think in some respects getting older gets a bad rap. I think life actually gets better as you get older, at least it has for me thus far. And one of the things that makes it better is the fact that you don't really feel a lot of need to pretend to be something that you're not. So like sports that I don't really care about, like I'm not very international. Like I am not a sophisticated global citizen. I'm just not. So therefore, the kinds of sports that would make me appear to be more sophisticated on a global scale, don't feel any need to pretend to care about those things at all. At all. And so, and if, by the way, if you do like that, if you're, into that kind of thing, I'm not mad at you for that either. But I do enjoy the fact that I just get to be what I am without having to try to pretend to be otherwise. Let's get ready to bounce around here a little bit more. Miriam Corbin says, as an alum, I'm upset at the rah-rah issue plus the driving things. Let me read the rest of this. I hope it stops. I do not blame Kirby. These young men, the team leadership need to step up their behavior and make changes. Stop bringing disparagement on my university, which I think is reflective of how a lot of Georgia fans feel. Like I said, Georgia fans don't want bad headlines about their team. I think some people sort of assume, and we perhaps sometimes assume this of other fan bases, that all they care about is winning. They don't care about anything else. Well, I think that Miriam's opinion there is fairly reflective of how a lot of people feel, which is that, you want to feel good about who it is that you're rooting for. Now, the stuff that, I feel like I've heard about Georgia hasn't changed the way I feel about UJ overall, but this point still stands, is that there's a certain desire to feel like your cheers for Georgia are going to a good cause, that you're cheering for players and coaches who are worthy and deserving of those cheers. I still feel that way about UJ, but obviously that's one of the reasons why, Georgia fans themselves are going to have the strongest reaction to sort of bad headlines as it relates to Georgia. Ken Holcomb says, I love certain sports in the Olympics and cheering on the USA against other countries. My favorite international competition at this stage of my life, I love the Ryder Cup. This is the one that happens every other year where, the U.S. competes against the European nations in golf. America always wins on American soil, always loses on European soil, really frustrating. For a long time, Europe sort of had America's number in the Ryder Cup as it is. That's my favorite international competition. It brings out, good stuff, and everybody really, really enjoy that. All right, a few more comments here. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark says Heupel has to beat Georgia this year. I guarantee that's a mark for him and his boss. He says his job is riding on it, my humble opinion. Spencer, let me push back on that here just a little bit, because this is the thing that I think we sort of forget here a little bit. Because Georgia as a program is like up here. Now, even if it doesn't win the national championship this year, we still assume it's going to achieve enough to sort of remain, as lofty as it sort of has been viewed to be. Like Georgia is a very high achieving program. You can be well below Georgia as a program and still be pretty high achieving. See, this is the interesting thing about the SEC here right now, is that we don't really know what Tier 2 in the SEC looks like right now. I think we assume that Georgia is a Tier 1, and we're curious to see, hey, can Texas do it for a second year in a row? Can Alabama do it without Nick Saban? And if so, they're also kind of in that Tier 1 with Georgia. The Tier 2 for right now is sort of totally up for grabs. I think it might be Ole Miss, I think it might be Missouri, but you're also kind of betting on something you haven't really seen with your own eyes before. Like, what if Tennessee became a program that lost to Georgia every year for this foreseeable future, but they were mostly beating everybody else, especially in a 12-team playoff world? It's like you could continue to lose to Georgia, but if you're going 9-3, 10-2, which would be a real accomplishment for Heupel individually, Tennessee collectively, if you could do that, as of right now, that'd be an example of Tennessee doing its job. And that's sort of what I see as the next thing for them. Not competing with Georgia. That may never happen. But can they beat everybody else? And if they can, then what does that mean? It's that sort of pecking order below Georgia, Bama, Texas that I think is pretty interesting. And I think that Tennessee's got about as good a shot as anybody to be the sort of best of the rest, the kind of kings of Tier 2. I think they could maybe do that. Jonathan Aaron says, is it true that I prefer great value mustard over Frank's because you don't want to help Tennessee's NIL fund? Yeah. Anything that I can do. We just had a very long trip. I told you. So we had to drive to New York because we had an issue with our flight when it came to the Cooperstown trip. So as you're driving back, I know what's-his-face does the gas station thing, but I like gas stations too. I could have been a truck driver. I think that kind of thing is fun. So I am doing my best to stop at a Love's or there's no Buc-ee's, going to New York, at least the way we went. I'm doing everything I can to keep from having to stop at that Pilot place. The Pilot Flying J, that's owned by Jimmy Haslam, who's a big Tennessee booster. So I'm trying my best not to stop at a Pilot if I can help it, because that's just putting money in Nico Imaleva's pocket. That's putting money into Josh Heupel's budget. Like, I'm trying to avoid that at all costs. Plus, let me not say that. There'd be some question about how some of that money might be used in addition to Tennessee booster stuff too, but let me not go there. Stephen Venanzi enjoying some of the stuff we did over the course of the last couple of weeks. I love to hear that. Lance D shouting out QT and Buc-ee's. Yeah, I mean, listen, I love and they'll never advertise with us, but I don't mind telling you, I love the Buc-ee's brisket sandwich. It's good. And it's not smoked. I mean, it doesn't have that smoky flavor, but it's still good. I mean, it's very, very good. And it's just a fun place to stop. All right, let's do a couple more comments. We're ready to leave. DT says, I'm not convinced yet that Texas is Tier 1 after one high-level season. Asking for them to do it more than once is a fair concern. I'd say that's probably fair. Now, the thing that I was impressed with Texas a year ago was, after a long time of having this not be true, they were good on the lines of scrimmages last year. They've got to, replace some guys on the defensive side, but this is, I would say, a very SEC-looking offensive line here right now. BMAC says if Georgia goes 12-0 this season, they'll be for sure ranked number 1. And, we've kind of said this before, that we're kind of on guard when sometimes Georgia maybe doesn't get all the credit it sometimes deserves. A little sensitive about some of that kind of stuff sometimes maybe. If Georgia were to go 12-0 this year against this schedule, they would be deserving of a lot of credit for one of the most significant accomplishments we've seen. It'll be interesting to see if they actually get that. Gerald Harmon says we need to have Rush Probst on as a guest. Listen, there is nobody better at talking about football than Probst is. I got that great drawl. I've interviewed him many times for some of the games we've done. And a lot of times it's sort of a private setting where he's going to really he's just going on and talking and telling stories. He'd just do it all day long. So I know Probst had his issues, of course, but no one denies how much he knows about football. And his ability to talk football is pretty remarkable. Pretty remarkable. Winfred Steinspring, thanks for the welcome back. Appreciate that. Matt Rukavina taking some of his customary shots at Tennessee, which he likes to do. All right, we're going to get ready to go for now. So nice long comment section for today. Hope you enjoyed that. Good to be back on the saddle again. Y'all do me a favor. Check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. Still really hot. Heat index well over 100 today. That means you want to stay cool and comfortable. So check out RS Andrews online to help you do that. Online, rsandrews.com. Have a great day. Back tomorrow. More fun then. DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then.